Hi, Stitchers. Welcome to Tatreez Talk, where we share conversations about Palestinian embroidery. I'm Amani here with my co-host Lena, chatting with talented embroiderers and artists, sharing their stories, inspirations, and the cultural significance behind their work.
On today's episode, we're bringing back Wafa Ghanim for a special bonus release to discuss thread over time in Palestinian Tatreez. If you don't already know who Wafa is, make sure you go check out episode 4 and just know that she is the researcher, educator, archivist, and the face behind Tatreez and Tea. Wafa, thank you so much for joining us at Tatreez Talk yet again. It is a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, we're really excited to have you. And today, really, we want to start a conversation about Tatreez embroidery thread specifically. Like, we want to talk about what that is like. We want to talk about the history of that. And so we really want to dive in deep with you today. But let's start out with what types of thread were historically used in Palestinian embroidery?
Yeah, so we do know, like when we're looking at the traceable origins of embroidery technique in the region specifically, because we're, when you're talking about tatreez, when you're talking about dress and thwabs, like you have to think about as well all of the other elements and materials that are used that each have their own set of histories. So thread specifically, and its practice in embroidery in the region is long-standing, centuries-old practice. So we do know that 100% because we've seen it in mummies and other types of evidences in museums and so forth. By like the mid-19th century or so, we're still, and to the late 19th century, we're actually still using silk threads. Silk is the primary thread that's being used in our embroidery and on our dress. And from a textile perspective, so there's the threads that are used for embroidery and threading the needle, but then there's also threads that are woven in the textiles that produce the textiles. And those were cotton, linen, and silk. And they could have been imported from Egypt or Syria. So it comes from multiple sources. And in terms of specifically embroidery thread, those were imported from Syria. The main textile production centers in Syria in the 19th century were Homs, Aleppo, and Damascus. So they had a whole industry in Syria around weaving and thread and spinning thread and that whole production. And also what leads up to that, which is like cocoon cultivation and like silkworms and the mulberry trees that grew and the leaves that came off that fed silkworms that gave high quality silk, right? So, I mean, everything from the agriculture on mulberry trees to silkworm cocoon cultivation to the pulling of the silk from the worm to the, spinning of the thread. That all was the primary industry in Syria since the 7th century or even before. I mean, Syria was the main central place for silk, or harir, which is the term in Arabic. So, and then just as kind of like a final note on that question is that floss silk specifically used by Palestinian women in their embroidery has been documented in our history books as specifically coming from Homs. So it was produced in Homs and Mount Lebanon, and then it was either dyed in Homs and Damascus or dyed locally in Palestine using natural and organic materials.
I'm assuming today, obviously, that is no longer a trade that's really being done in the region. Is that correct?
It is. I mean, it is certainly. I mean, you can find some pockets, but from an industry and economy perspective, it's just not it has not been a sustainable industry since the late Ottoman Empire. And to bore you with a little more history, the organic dyeing of thread kind of totally stopped when the invention of synthetic dyes came about, because that produced brighter, more vibrant colors. And, there was that part of it. But also by the late 19th century, European manufacturers of thread, actually many different manufacturers of thread, were selling like various color shades, even in these synthetic dyed, products, right? And that consistency in color shades, I think, was really attractive to Palestinians, specifically within the dressmaking context, because if you look at dresses being produced in the late 19th century, turn of the century, and then early 20th century, there is significantly more embroidery on the dresses. It's more dense than really ever before, because during this time, especially, the economy of Palestine was booming. There was like a renaissance kind of happening in the Arab world for art and culture all across the Arab world, and Palestine was no exception. And then Palestine was, heavily by that time, a tourist destination for like Holy Land pilgrimage. And it boomed, the economy boomed. So we see that reflected in the dress, the economic and social conditions of the women. We see it in their dress through, in part, the density of the embroidery.
And, that's really interesting to hear, because I think I even think about it when I think of, why I tend to pick certain thread brands, because of that color consistency. But there is something really like beautiful about that traditional natural dye process, which, I personally really want to learn myself, because I just think it's a beautiful process and really can connect you even further into your practice of Tatreez. And, that your answer actually brought up another follow-up question. Would love to kind of dive into talking about the external influences on Palestinian embroidery, such as trade, obviously colonialism, and how that really impacted thread usage.
Well, usually when we see the fall of any empire, we start to see certain material productions from the empire lose like value. So for instance, coins have less silver content. I mean, it's just sort of part of the fall of an empire, that process. And so the late Ottoman Empire, we start to see these shifts happening. And then, of course, there was World War I, and then following the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, where the French and the British basically developed this secret treaty to divide this Bled de Sham, the Greater Syria, for their own benefit. And so because present day Syria was such a hub for weaving and silk production, and imagine the economy of Palestine for tourism and things like that, we're talking now about a significant amount of profit that can be gained by these, colonialist powers. And it's really no surprise that France wanted to take Syria, because Syria had the silk and the threads and the everything like that. And the French were known for fashion at the time, and they wanted to remain the sort of hub for fashion. And so that connection was there. And ultimately, we now use even French thread companies, French companies that produce thread. We even use those today from that very colonialist legacy that we know of. And for Palestine specifically, we were under the British mandate. And the British, if you were to sort of review, which I don't recommend because it's not fun, but if you were to read through their intelligence reports during the mandate, you can see that they took very detailed notes and statistics and tracked weaving, fabric production, anything related to that industry, because apparently it was really prosperous and they wanted to bring in more European brands into Palestine and into the greater region, because that industry was so strong there. They wanted a cut of it. Right? They wanted to profit from it, right? That's why this part of the world was attractive to them. There was a lot of tourism, there was a lot of good handicrafts and a great economy. So how long was that going to go? anyways, so all of these kinds of factors, I think, really contributed towards really the total loss of local thread production, local weaving traditions and practices. I think Palestinians specifically, because I can't speak to other communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, but I do know from my own oral history kind of work and dress history work that generally speaking, while from a weaving perspective and fabric production, it was not welcome to have so much European domination because they wanted kind of a mix, right? There was this idea of like, oh, I like using European fabrics, but I also like to use these other fabrics, right? I think with thread specifically, it was more embraced, like that kind of a historical shift. And because it was a dying kind of vocation. I mean, it was a lot of, there was a lot of impoverished conditions because of this industry by that time, by the early 20th century. And so I think there was a welcoming in that, but then there was also, really important quality aspects to thread that, and I think it was actually, in fact, cheaper to buy cotton, pearlized cotton thread, that had a sheen on it that was kind of similar to the glow of silk, that glossy kind of feeling. But then also pearlized cotton and the twist of pearlized cotton from these, specifically French thread makers. It was very high quality and the color was steadfast, so it didn't bleed onto the rest of the garment. And I think that was attractive to Palestinian makers.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know we'll go into it a little bit later, but people always ask about, floss versus pearl cotton and when to use which. But yeah, I always go back to kind of exactly to your point. It's like that pearl cotton, it's very durable, especially for a thwab. But we'll get into that in a little bit.
So, Wafa, I'd also like to just probe a little bit more into the cultural heritage traditions of thread within Palestinian Tatreez more specifically. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The production, like the spinning of thread specifically, the shearing of animals, the spinning of thread, the weaving of fabric, at least within the last few centuries, has been passed between father and son. And men and boys. And that, and I have always found it really actually beautiful because there's often this misconception that textile traditions in our part of the world were entirely women's domestic labor. And I often get the question of like, well, what did men do? Did men embroider? When you look at our cultural heritage specifically within a textile context, it's always been a partnership between men and boys and women and girls, because men and boys would, shepherd the animals and shear the fur and spin the thread and weave the fabric. And there's also a fraught history of weaving and everything that we're going to just, not refer to now because that's a whole other episode. But that all would get prepared and women and girls will then ornament, which is embroidery, but other types of adornment. They would ornament the fabric that was woven and then they would prepare it for wear. And so this partnership between these genders, I think, is just really important to consider, that there might be some cultural misconceptions happening contemporarily around textiles because of the way that Palestinian women, Muslim women, Arab women have been portrayed for so long, like in America and in Europe, and sort of the legacy of that as affecting even our most basic understanding of our own cultural heritage. And this is, of course, not to say Palestinians were all Muslim. Of course, this is very pluralistic. I mean, I would say the textile heritage of Palestinians also most beautifully exceeded any religious or ethno-religious community, that this is truly these were pluralistic, diverse societies that had a different way than other parts of the world to engage with textiles, to engage with dress. And it was not just women or of one particular part of the community.
Yeah, you're also triggering a memory of I was reading a book, I can't remember which one, and it was describing the Palestinian wedding traditions in the early 1900s, and it mentions how, you know, when a woman is getting married to a man, the man's family would provide all the materials to the woman's family to then, you know, embroider them and adorn them and put them together to wear for the wedding festivities. So that's 100%. I'm so happy that you brought that up because it's not commonly known. No, people don't really think about. They just assume that everything that has to do with a thobe, for example, is completely women dominated, and there was actually a very big role for men, historically speaking. So thank you so much for sharing more on that.
I think it's also most eloquently represented in headdresses. Today, there's this huge obsession by Americans and Europeans about our dowry, the dowry of our people, and how men and the coins represented and the jewelry that we wear is because we're being purchased by the groom's family. But historically, the headdress also included coins and jewelries and adornments that were inherited by your own family. So it wasn't just dowry. And I find that to be such a, there's such a lack of nuance in the discussion of female identity. So for us Palestinians, but for all the women in that region in the world, like there's just this, like always this interest in like, how were we bought and sold and how were we covered? And it all feeds into this greater colonialist narrative that is ultimately meant to dehumanize us, not just women, but the men as well, as though we are just kind of like herded animals, being purchased and sold. And this again stems from propaganda, from like the British Mandate and other kinds of sources.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that too, because I think about today and like I think about my family specifically and the weddings that our family has, and it's always very common for both sides of the family to give gold to the bride. And it has always been spoken about in my family as very much, this is for the bride, this is to secure her independence. And, you know, I think all the positive things that the three of us have probably been taught. And so it's always interesting when I hear these outside perspectives of what Palestinian women are, what Palestinian men are, because I'm just like, you definitely have not encountered any Palestinians. It's very clear. And I think it is nice to see this, like, even as both of you guys were talking, Wafa, as you were talking about kind of the men and the boys doing the weaving and the women and the girls doing the embroidery, and Lena, you're reminiscing on this story from the book. It has this beautiful, like, effortless unity that like really flows very naturally, and I feel that so deeply when I am around other Palestinians. You know, it's just not even in like a gender state, but just everything just flows very naturally. Like I grew up in a community with Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians, and like, I mean, it wasn't like no one cared. Like it wasn't, there was just this very like beautiful flow of, yeah, we're Palestinian. And now I'm just going off into a whole other thing, but I just, you know, it took me there. That unity, that seamless unity really took me there. So,
yeah. And I don't want to like mislead your listeners. Certainly there are other cultural communities like indigenous, you know, First Nation, indigenous communities where they do have similar partnerships in textile productions. And, you know, especially like, for instance, indigenous communities here in North America, I'm finding their traditions are very similar to ours, but also this is kind of a greater fabric, not just this effortless unity within Palestinians, but I think within all indigenous communities, where we do have a very particular kind of relationship with the land and one another. And it's it's sort of this highest form of duty and honor that we have to serve the earth and the land and to serve one another, and of course like our higher power. So I think these are greater indigenous concepts. That is what we're seeing, and certainly it wouldn't be only exceptional to Palestinians, and it's worth considering for other indigenous communities.
Absolutely. So speaking about land, you mentioned earlier about this idea that some of the thread would be brought to Palestine and then dyed locally. Can you speak a little bit to that and how that impacts the color availability before kind of there was more of a manufactured approach to providing thread?
Actually, it's interesting because, so we have synthetic dyes, or like these sort of chemical dyes that were invented in Europe in the 1850s. And because there was such a high tourism to the Holy Land from Europe, I mean, look, this is my theory, and you're not going to find a source in a book to reference, so I could be wrong, but my working hypothesis is almost immediately we start to see synthetic dye availability in Palestine. But even if we were to look at threads, dyed by Kermes insects or cochineal insects, these are insects that grow in abundance in the desert, or other types of sources of organic dye. We do see sort of what we call fugitive situations where the dye is completely gone from certain parts. I mean, it didn't preserve well. Organic materials used to dye thread were not well preserved. And when you go into like synthetic dye periods, and there are like different generations, by the 1860s, they like fix all the problems, right, with the synthetic dyes, that we still see some variegation. And I've always kind of loved looking at different iterations of variegated thread from like various makers, even like Chinese makers today, because they all sort of intend to emulate that, where synthetic and organic dyed threads have areas where they're lighter and darker, and it's just kind of the beauty of it. And they sort of created a similar effect in the variegation of the threads. And that's how I sort of connect like where variegated threads might have come from, because those variegated threads started to be used, I think, in the 70s or 80s. So much later. But for me, that's how I understand variegated threads to exist. And now I'm not sure, I've forgotten now a little bit about your question. So if you can remind me.
No worries, no worries. No, I'm just curious if like the natural surroundings impacted how threads were dyed, for example, when they were doing more of a hand-dyed approach to thread making.
Like, did it impact, how they dyed it?
And like what colors were available, like my understanding, I could be completely wrong, but my understanding was the people who were hand dyeing their threads were looking around them, and they were finding colors that were present in their everyday surroundings, and that was what was most popular in the threads that were used on dresses of that time period and from that particular location. But I could be completely wrong. That was just my assumption and something that I had read somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent that has to be true, because it's all coming from plants and insects and things like that. That's the source of the dye. The benefit that synthetic dyes brought isn't just the vibrancy and color steadfastness, but I think also the shades.
Yeah.
And then when we start to have like more like broader manufacturing and industrialization of thread making, we start to see, very particular shades being determined and consistently like produced, right? So if you have a particular shade of red that you would like to finish your dress with, you don't have to go and try to buy all this silk thread and try to get it the exact same shade. So I think that that there have been different sort of benefits to these different generations of kind of thread use and dye sources and things like that.
And okay, I know I alluded to it earlier, but would really love to kind of dive into embroidery floss versus pearl cotton, because this is a question that gets asked a lot. And would love to just speak to you about, historically, the different use cases, and then as well as obviously today. But are there one particular type of thread that's better? For example, like for wearable items like a twab, like would pearl cotton be better than embroidery floss, and why? Like these are all questions I think we all probably get all the time from people. So would love to understand from you historically, like what was used and what worked for people.
Yeah, since the importing of pearl cotton threads in the late 1920s, maybe early 1930s, that has always been the choice of Palestinian women. 6-strand skeins, I think is what you're referring to when you talk about floss. Those, I mean, I have to say, never see them in thobes.
Yeah.
Ever. Perhaps in a contemporary context, never say never, because, within the last 20 to 30 years, anything goes. I mean, we're seeing like bedazzled thobes. So, certainly there's quite a variety within a contemporary context. But if we're talking about, 1990s and before, all the way back into the late 1920s, early 1930s, it's always been pearl cotton thread. And it's never been the 6-strand. But I think the 6-strand was always very popular in Europe and other places because they often embroidered tapestries.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it didn't have to be like worn, and it didn't, and they, that was just sort of their approach and how they used it. I mean, I tend to recommend, I've seen those questions come your way and my way as well, just in the years of my teaching. And I tend to just recommend that people don't, I mean, they can, but I wouldn't mix the two threads on a single piece because they both have such a different appearance and longevity. Some people still don't mind how that, visually and aesthetically, like, appears at that, when they're done with their project, and for them, more power to them. But I already carry so much regret by the end of a project that I wouldn't want to add to the list by not at least letting them know, and all of your listeners know, that you might want to do like a little sampler of both, 6-strand thread pulled off. You probably want to pull off 2 of those 6, compare it to, pearl cotton thread, and kind of see if you like how aesthetically those are near one another.
Yeah. And I will say for my thobe, I will be stitching with pearl cotton. I am starting my thobe. I got my fabric. I'm starting it, and I will be stitching with pearl cotton. But I do use embroidery floss for most of my pieces because they're framed. Like you said, just like you said, tapestry, like most of my stuff I like to frame. So, but thank you for answering that.
Mabruk on starting a thobe.
Thank you. I'm
and it's
excited.
recorded. It's recorded that she's using pearl cotton. So
yeah, that's it.
We'll have to see it now.
Verbal contract.
I know. I'll ask the community for help. I know I will, for colors and all that. So stay tuned.
Amazing.
I do also want to mention one thing. I think what's really important to kind of remember when we're looking at threads and thinking about thread history in Palestine is to consider the color language of thread in our dress history. Specifically, I think about in Ramallah, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with Maha Abu Shoshe, who consulted or worked with the Palestine Museum in Bir Zayt, but carries her own very beautiful, significant collection of historic dress. She has a great understanding about the different shades of red that represented different villages and towns in Ramallah alone. and how different shades of red could connect specifically to a regional identity, but also to a specific neighborhood identity, or family identity. And that color literacy is being completely lost, I think, in this context. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I look sometimes at the trajectory of like change in our traditions over the last 2 centuries, and it is always met with like grief and loss because, I know the circumstances that caused that is, dispossession and in part a very concerted cultural dispossession of the Palestinian people. But I also think it's wrong to assume that all these shifts in traditions are negative, because Palestinians specifically are not a stagnant people, not in the diaspora, but also never in history. We've always evolved our dress. And part of the reason it's survived against all odds this past century and a half, but also throughout the centuries, is because it is an art form that has evolved in lockstep with the women who've practiced it. It's carried tradition in it inherently in the practice and technique, but the materials themselves have evolved over time. We see this with metallic threads, really can need a whole episode on that. But just to kind of encourage people who are doing embroidery in the community, to encourage you to, and also sort of impart myself, that if we find that a revival of Palestinian thread, local thread, or different thread makers that tell our story better and have symbolism that reflects our identity and our needs today, that it would not be a terrible loss to shift to those thread makers. It would actually be a part of the way that we keep this heritage alive, to reflect who we are today and what we know today.
Yeah, absolutely. Wafa, thank you so much. Every time we have an episode with you, you just drop the mic.
I know. I love it. I love it.
So
I just
good.
I'm sitting back like, yes, yes, girl, yes.
I love it. I love it. I love it. And this actually leads into like my final question. It's not really much of a question, but just in case you have an answer, do you recommend any resources? I know like your book, for example, has a few pages that are really cool about the colors and what, the regions in which those colors are most predominant over time and how that's shifted. But do you have other resources as well, in addition to perhaps other chapters of your book that you want to mention as well, where people can learn more about thread in Palestinian embroidery?
Yeah, absolutely. So just in terms of like what I've published and then what other people, so what I published, Tatreez and Tea does have a table about different organic sources for natural dye in Palestine. Thobna, my second publication, I did a really elaborate, like whole color palette scheme for various time periods, because that was something that was always asked by students over the years. So Thobna has a really good reference to like colors and shades of different regions and time periods that expands on the Encyclopedia of Embroidery in the Arab World by Gillian Vocalsing Eastwood. And that, she does kind of start the conversation for the late 20th century. And I took it back into the ancient period and added more in Thobna. Another good reference on thread colors is a book called Embroidering Identities. And it was written by Iman Sakka, the daughter of Maha Sakka, who is this like iconic cultural heritage pioneer, Sakka, S-A-C-A. And that's a free PDF download on the Oriental Institute, or now University of Chicago website. It's available, and it talks about different thread colors. Another good source is Sheila Ware's Palestinian Costume that was originally published in 1989. And some of her information is not true, specifically around Bedouin color meanings, but she does talk about sources of like thread making and thread making traditions, and for that she was correct. Like I'll just call it out, but she specifically refers to like red embroidery as representing sexual maturity, which is total fadiha and not true at all.
Where did that come from? Yeah.
I don't know.
Whiteness.
I mean, I can't speak to that, but I just want people to be aware as well that not all the books are 100% correct. They're like every other discipline and study in the world. It evolves. 1989 was a different time. So
yeah.
But those are the main ones. And then I do want to mention Tatreez Center in Amman, Jordan, does do workshops led by Roba, the curator, on how to dye threads with organic materials. And those are absolutely worth exploring when she does, promote them and schedule them.
I need to do one of those.
Yeah, we will be looking that up.
Yeah. We will be harassing them for that.
So good. So good. Wafa, thank you again so much for the time as usual. I mean, brilliant knowledge, brilliant history. We love having you. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be so grateful to have this kind of knowledge shared with them as well. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Wafa.
Thank you.